This week, we're going to talk about stress and reproduction. So let's look at how stress interacts with reproduction. For the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA, which in other words is sort of like the stress axis. So this is your brain, your hypothalamus in the brain, senses that there is something stressful either in the environment or either inside the internal condition of the individual. And in response to that, it will release corticotropin releasing hormone, which would act in the pituitary. The pituitary will respond by releasing adrenocorticotropin hormone, which will then act in the adrenal glands, in particular in the adrenal cortex, to stimulate the release of glucocorticoids, such as cortisol in the case of humans. If you're looking at rats or mice, it will be corticosterone. But there is a variety of glucocorticoids that can also be produced. But there is another side of the coin that is very similar, but has a very different function, and that is the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis, and this is abbreviated as HPG. If the HPA was the stress axis, this will be the reproductive axis. So in the HPG, the hypothalamus senses that the conditions are good for reproduction, and in response to that, it will produce gonadotropin releasing hormone that would act in the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland in response will produce two types of hormones that are stimulating hormones, the follicle stimulating hormone or the luteinizing hormone. Those hormones will act in the gonad, and the gonads in response will produce sex steroids. In the male, common sex steroid is testosterone, and in females, the sex steroid will be estrogen. Sex steroids are those produced by the gonads, either estrogen or testosterone, but the word steroids is a whole class of hormones that not only includes sex steroids such as estrogen and testosterone, but also includes glucocorticosteroids. So those are also a type of steroid hormones, and what steroid hormones have in common is that they are derived from cholesterol. So they are a lipid hormone, and as a lipid hormone, they cannot easily travel in the blood. They often need to travel in the blood bound to some protein or some carrier protein that will let them dissolve in the blood and be carried by the blood. But since they are lipids, they can easily cross the plasma membrane, which is lipid based, and they can enter the cell and they can activate receptors inside of the cell, and they can also enter the nucleus and activate gene expression. So that's why you see these long-lasting effects of these steroid hormones, either cortisol, which is a glucocorticosteroid, or estrogen and testosterone, which are sex steroids. So this is in contrast to what you see in adrenaline. We're not talking about adrenaline in this case, although adrenaline is also released during the stress response, but more in the acute response, so that's in the immediate response. And adrenaline, or epinephrine, is a polar hormone which can easily travel in the plasma. It can easily dissolve in water, but it cannot cross the plasma membrane, so it will have to activate receptors on the surface of the cell. And the receptors that it activates in the tissues, as you've seen in previous videos, they tend to have very quick effects. So these are things that happen within seconds. So let's take a closer review at how the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis works. You might also see it as HPI, and this is in fish, they don't have adrenal glands. Instead of adrenal glands, they have a diffuse tissue that is the interrenal tissue. So that's why the abbreviation for HPI. So you'll see HPI in fish, HPA in other vertebrates. So like we said earlier, the hypothalamus is the one that sort of is the command center. It's integrating information about the external environment. If it senses a stressful situation or stressful conditions inside of the organism, it will release corticotropin releasing hormone. It might also release tyrosine releasing hormone, and that would act in the pituitary. The pituitary response produces adrenocorticotropin hormone, or there are also other groups of these hormones called melanocortins that it can also produce. So it can produce melanocortin stimulating hormone, and those hormones will act in the interrenal tissues if you're a fish, or the adrenal gland in other vertebrates, and stimulate the production of glucocorticosteroids such as cortisol in the case of fish. In the case of humans, if you're looking at rats or mice, it will be cortisone. And parallel to this, you have the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So here again, you have the hypothalamus that is integrating the information. It says, okay, the conditions in the external environment are conducive to reproducing right now, and the internal condition, the body condition of the organism is in good shape, has good reserves, is a good time to reproduce. So the hypothalamus will release gonadotropin releasing hormone that will act in the pituitary. The pituitary response will produce follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone, which will act in the gonad, and the gonad in response will produce sex steroids, androgens in males, and estrogen in females. So as you can see, both of these axes have very similar elements. Both is the hypothalamus that is integrating that information from the physical environment, the external environment, the social environment, and also the internal environment. What is the body condition, what's the health of the organism, and in response to that, make decisions to what needs to be done and what hormones will release. And those hormones will act in the pituitary gland, which will then release another set of hormones. And here is where we see the difference. Those hormones will act either in the adrenal gland or in the gonad. So if the external environment or the internal environment are conducive to reproduction, the hypothalamus will activate the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. But if conditions are not suited for reproduction and instead there is an emergency that needs to be addressed, either because of the physical environment or your internal body condition or health, then the hypothalamus will activate the HPA axis. Although the structures are similar, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, the hormones that they're releasing at the different times are different. So what typically happens during stress is that the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is going to cause a suppression in the activation of the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis. So stress will inhibit reproduction. So how does it do that? There are multiple known mechanisms in which this can happen, and which one acts depends on the species, or it might even depend on the organism and the point in time. So for instance, the release of ACTH or adrenocorticotropin hormone would inhibit the hypothalamus from releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone. So that will stop all the HPG axis from there on. But the inhibition might be caused by glucocorticosteroids themselves. So the release of cortisol will be the one that inhibits the hypothalamus, and that will really suppress the HPG axis. Or cortisol can act on other places in the HPG axis, such as the pituitary gland, inhibiting the release of FSH and LH. Or it might even act on the gonads directly and inhibit the production of sex steroids in the gonads themselves. But here's where it's interesting to look at how this works from an evolutionary perspective. Because when you're just looking at humans or a very selected group of animals, you're looking at organisms that have a very long life and have multiple opportunities for breeding. So if you look at an elephant or a polar bear, maybe things are not looking very bright right now. Maybe this is not the time to breed. If let's say there is a drought or there is not enough food available, then in that case, it's better to focus on surviving right now, and then things will be better in the future so that you will have energy and you will have resources available for you to reproduce and produce an offspring at that time that will have better chances to survive than if you do it right now when conditions aren't so good. But that's for organisms that will live a long life and have multiple breeding opportunities in the future. But what happens for organisms that don't live a long life, have a very short life, and don't have any future opportunities for reproducing? So this happens either for organisms that live a very short life and they have a very limited breeding season, but this might also happen in the same organism as it moves through life. And earlier on, when they're young, they'll have plenty of opportunities to reproduce in the future. But as they start getting older and their life expectancy is declining, then the opportunities for future reproduction are be limited, and they might switch to a different strategy. An extreme case of this is what we see in salmon. Most salmon only breathe once in their lifetime. So they have to put all their energy and all the resources into that one reproductive event to ensure that they produce as many offspring as possible, so that the chances of some of those offspring surviving in the future are as high as they can be. So with that, we can produce this model of how life history affects whether an organism will favor reproduction or favor investment in survival in the case of a stressful event. For organisms with future possibilities for reproduction, if they are faced with a stressful event, they will favor investing in survival, so the limited amount of energy that all organisms have, they will take that out from reproduction and funnel it towards survival so that they can ensure that they will survive this current crisis. And they know that if they survive this crisis, they will have better opportunities to reproduce in the future. So in these types of organisms, what you will see will be in the time of crisis, corticosteroids will go up, and those corticosteroids will inhibit reproduction so that the investment in steroid hormones will decrease and reproduction will be inhibited, and all the energy will be going towards surviving the current crisis. But organisms on the other spectrum of life history, where they don't have any expectations for future reproductive events, but the reproduction is either now or it won't happen at all, in that case, a stressful event will not decrease reproduction, and they will continue producing sex steroids even if there are stressful conditions. So in that case, they might be insensitive to the stressor, and they might not release corticosteroids in response to the stress. Or you might have cases of organisms where the amount of energy that it takes to reproduce is so large that they will have simultaneous increase of androgens and corticosteroids. So in this case, the amounts of corticosteroids produced are not suppressing reproduction, and you actually see both hormones in high amounts or high concentrations at the same time. In these organisms in where the energetic demand for reproduction is so high that they have both steroid hormones and corticosteroids increase at the same time, you will see a reminder here that this is a huge increase in the allostatic load. So these organisms have a very big allostatic load because they're trying to sustain reproduction while at the same time they're having high stress and probably energy limitations. Now, in this example, you notice that instead of having the general sex steroids, which could include estrogen in females and androgens in males, we only have androgens. And the reason for this is because most of these studies have been done in males of multiple species. And the reason for that is because most of the researchers who did this work way back then were mostly males, and they were mostly interested in studying males. So unfortunately, not much research has been done in the physiology of females in species with this extreme life history. But as the field is becoming more diverse and more females are joining science, we're starting to see a broader and more complete picture of what's happening in the different sexes. So we review what are the possible mechanisms in which stress inhibits reproduction. But what happens in those species that are able to reproduce despite having high levels of stress? And in those organisms, what might happen is maybe the HPA is not activated at all. The hypothalamus is not sensitive. It doesn't perceive what's happening as stressful, or it blocks the perception of it as stressful. Or there is an inhibition in the production of corticosteroid hormones, such as cortisol. Or there could be a desensitization where the hypothalamus is not sensitive to having either ACTH or cortisol that would traditionally inhibit the HPG response of the hypothalamus. So there could be an inhibition there. Or the inhibition could be in the pituitary gland where it's not responding to high cortisol and it's continuing its activation of the HPG axis. And in resistance to the inhibitory effects of the HPA axis onto the HPG axis, you will see that sex steroids are still increasing despite the activation of the HPA axis. And in some cases, you might even see things such as hormones from the stress axis are actually acting and favoring reproduction. So this is one of the things that we see in the electric fish that I studied. I was telling you earlier that it's a very short-lived species. Hormones from the stress response actually act to increase reproductive behaviors. And when the energy needed for reproduction is so high because the organism is trying to invest all its energy into reproducing, you will see not only an increase in androgens during activation of the stress response, but simultaneous increase in sex steroids and cortisol or glucocorticoids. Okay, so I hope with this you can see the broad range of animal adaptations and how they're using the stress response based on their own life history. And getting this wider knowledge can help us understand human physiology from a broader perspective.